Last time we were looking here at chapter 2, verse 1 to verse 2, where Paul exhorts the church in Philippi, "Fulfill ye my joy." And we were speaking about the joy of unity. In verse 1, he gave 4 motives or incentives to unity. If there be any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any bowels and mercies. If these things be true, and furthermore, if you have experienced them to be true, then it has implications for how you should live as a congregation of the Church of Christ. And so he exhorts them in verse 2, "Fill up my joy." And he says in particular that they were to strive for unity in purpose, action, and love. "Fulfill ye my joy, that ye be like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind." Now he continues into verse 3 and 4, dealing with the same subject. The joy of unity, verse 1 to verse 2, but key to this, key to maintaining it, is humility in Christian service. How you are to think of yourself, how you are to think of others, and how you are, on that basis, to serve them. And so verse 3, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves," and so on. This is how you are to function as a unified body of believers. And so verse 3 and verse 4 constitutes an exhortation that we're going to call today a call to humility. Then following on from that, in verse 5, he enforces it with the supreme illustration of what he's aiming for. "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. He humbled himself, and God exalted him." So we'll come to that, God willing, next week. But you're to have lowliness of mind to each other. And that's backed up by our having the mind of Jesus Christ as believers. So our theme this afternoon is a call to unity. And it consists in 3 things from these verses. The first is kill pride. Kill pride. You see how he puts it there in verse 3. "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory." He uses the universal term. I always counsel my children, be very careful with universals. The use of every, all, never, always. He never does that. She always does this. Be very careful with the use of universals. But Paul uses it rightly here. Here is a universal negative. Christians ought never to do this in anything. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. Those, brethren, are 2 features of the sin of pride. And every one of us has the poison of pride within our hearts. Indeed, pride in many ways could be described as the basic sin. The sin that is at the root of all others. So, for example, God says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Why do we have other gods before God? Well, ultimately it's rooted in pride, rejection of his word, extolling something that we ought not to extol, very likely ourselves. It's there at the root of pride. Why do we lie? Why do we steal? Why do we hurt one another with our words? Very often it's linked to the sin of pride. Pride was the first sin that Satan tempted our first parents with in the Garden of Eden. God says, "Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil," but Satan comes and says, well, he's only saying that because he knows you'll be as gods, knowing good and evil. And so he fuels pride in the hearts of Eve in particular, and Adam follows suit. That's interesting too, because sin, or pride, is the sin that Satan himself got kicked out of heaven for. If you turn in your Bibles to Isaiah chapter 14, you'll see how God links the fall of Satan or Lucifer to this sin of pride. Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 12 and following. Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? For thou hadst said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. The Most High God, who is often described as the Most High God, the creator of the heavens and earth, the possessor of heaven and earth. Satan says, I am going to be like him. There's the sin of pride. What you should understand is that the sin of pride has a tremendous power, however, to blind. So that the more proud you are, the less likely you are going to recognize it. And indeed, the more likely you're going to refuse to hear anything about it. But Paul is aiming at it here. He's stressing the importance of killing this pride within our heart. He would have agreed with the Puritan Stephen Charnock, a proud faith is as much a contradiction as a humble devil. Well, as I said, there are two features here of the sin of pride. The first is strife. Let nothing be done through strife. He means faction, rivalry, or competition. Let nothing be done, motivated by that in the church. Kind of party spirit that we've mentioned before, that you find in the church in Corinth. I'm of Paul, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Apollos, those kind of things. Let nothing be done out of this kind of strife. Contrast that with chapter 1. Some preach Christ, even of envy and strife. Christian service masquerading as being for the honor of the Lord, and yet it's rooted in this partisan spirit, using position, abusing the truth of God, in that case, to get one over on the Apostle Paul. Paul writes to the Philippians and says, don't do this because it's wicked. And furthermore, Christians are only too prone to do it. It's a terrible thing. But we have to aim at the sins of the pulpit. Where you get pride in the heart and the experience of a pastor, and what he can do through that pride is not just elevate himself and try to show off his gifts. He can be motivated by strife. So he employs the pulpit as a tool in order to attack a section of the congregation. Sad to say that happens in pulpits across the land. It happens also in church courts, where those who have the power, because they want to consolidate that power, or maybe an accusation is being levied against those, and they want to gather round and protect that group of individuals, they then employ the power of church courts, motivated by this kind of partisan strife. Now we're coming to you. We've been at the pulpit and we've been in the church courts, but it's in the pew. And that's what Paul's aiming at here. Let nothing be done by strife. Can you turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3? 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and look there, verse 1 to verse 3. And I, brethren, could not speak unto you as unto spiritual, but as unto carnal, even as unto babes in Christ. I have fed you with milk and not with meat, for hitherto ye were not able to bear it, neither yet now are ye able, for ye are yet carnal. Maybe in the 1980s and 90s you heard the whole debate, is there such a thing as a carnal Christian? Well, there is. Clearly, there is. Not in the sense as it was being used then, but there is a carnal and immature Christian. What are the features of carnal Christianity? For whereas there is among you envying and strife and divisions, are ye not carnal and walk as men? So if you want to test your maturity as a Christian, you can trace it by this kind of partisan, strife, contending spirit within your heart. This kind of carnality kills relationships, it destroys ministries, and it ruins congregations. And Satan is standing there in the sidelines like the cheerleader. Give me a P, give me an R, give me an I, give me a D, give me an E. What do you have? Destruction. Let nothing be done by strife. The second feature is vainglory. Let nothing be done by vainglory or selfish ambition, whereby men want to make a reputation for themselves. They love the praise of others. Paul, writing to the church in Galatia, says something similar in chapter 5 and verse 26. Let us not be desirous of vainglory, provoking one another, envying one another. It's evidently a problem in the New Testament church. In Galatians chapter 5, he is of course linking it to a work of the flesh, carnal Christianity. Do not be motivated in anything that you do by what you think men may think about you. We're not in the business of seeking to get honor for ourselves. Well, we ought not to be. But can I ask you to sincerely answer this before the Lord? How strong is that spirit within your own heart? Vainglory. You seek it. You want the recognition, the acknowledgement, and the praise. You say, well, I'm not really conscious that I do that. Okay. How do you react when you don't get it? You sit down and grumble, I'm doing all these things and nobody sees it. What's behind that? God sees us, of course, but that's not enough for you. You know, you want other people to see it, so they might pat you in the back and say, well done, you're such a wonderful Christian. What about the preacher? Let's start with him again. He likes people to think well of him. He doesn't want people to go away thinking, you know, he's awful. What a terrible sermon. Week after week, can't understand a thing that he says. He doesn't want to hear that. Be careful with preachers. Don't flatter them. It's the last thing that they need. Encourage them, but that's not by flattery. Preachers struggle with this. What about parents? Do parents struggle with this? You know, you put all this time into parenting and it's not going the way that it should go and you react. But why do you react? Because you want to have these kind of perfect kids so that everybody might think your family has it all together, so that it's self-reflective ultimately. So much pride in parenting. Listen to yourself. How do you speak about yourself? You're always telling people about what you did and how good what you did is. You are the subject of your own conversation far too often. Or be careful at the other end of the scale. When you're shy, you think, come on, Pastor, the last person in the world who's going to be proud is the shy person. Not so. Why are they shy? Because they're so self-conscious. Why are they so self-conscious? Because they're afraid about what people think about them and say about them, to the point that they're paralyzed by pride. But it's not coming out as talking about themselves all the time. It's just worrying about what everybody else is saying about them all the time. That's still vainglory. That's still pride. If Satan cannot stop you doing a good work, he will make you proud in the performance of it. And God will not tolerate your pride. He says, I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory will I not give unto another, neither my praise to graven images. Our motivation must be to serve God and to serve man for God's sake, not self. We must be governed by a principle of self-disinterest. So that's the first thing in our call to humility today. Kill pride. Secondly, cultivate humility. Cultivate humility. In verse 3, Paul gives the negative and then the positive. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. So the first half of the verse is telling us what to avoid or what to kill. The second is telling us what to cultivate and promote. This is a very helpful principle for your sanctification. The best way that you can deal with any sin in your life is to cultivate the opposite virtue. To cultivate the opposite virtue. Kill pride. Cultivate humility. Now, Paul puts it like this, that we are to be lowly in our minds. And as I said, he's going to enforce that by the supreme example of Jesus. Let this mind, this humble mind, be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Though he was God, he made himself of no reputation. He takes upon him the form of the servant, and he's obedient unto death. Humility of mind. Now you'll note Paul doesn't simply say, I want you to do outward acts that look humble. He's going under the surface, as he always does. And he says, I want you to have this as an experience on the inside. Lowliness of mind. I want your actions to be outwardly meek because your hearts are sincerely humble before the Lord. Not just the outward demeanor, whereby you pretend meekness and you manipulate others by a false humility. Paul says there's no room for it, none whatsoever. Nothing is to be done by strife or vainglory. On the other hand, everything is to be done with lowliness of mind. Your thoughts about yourself are to be sincerely humble. That is not instinctive to us. One way you can test it is this. What do you think when you realize someone else has a low estimate about you? Now, you see this in the world all the time. Somebody criticizes another person. They might sit silently and bite their lip, and then they get among their friends. Did you hear what he said about me? He said I was this. She said I was that. And now we're in this little enclave of friends, and we're baring our teeth. And we're criticizing this person for their criticism of us. We're not actually sitting down to ask ourselves, well, was their criticism actually justified? Was their low view of me right? Is the problem with me because I have a high view of myself and I've just really learned how others are perceiving me accurately? And even if you answer all those questions no, and you say, well, I think they were wrong on this occasion, then think of all of the myriad other things they could have said about you, which were right. you soon discover that you don't really have low thoughts of yourself, but your thoughts are pretty high. I said that this humility is not instinctive because we wrestle with sin, but it should be. It should be natural. It should be natural to a Christian for this reason, because the Christian has the true knowledge of God. And as a result of that, the Christian is the only person in the world who can have the true knowledge of himself. Because the two things are linked. So you say, well, I'm a Christian, yes. If you're a Christian, then you see your smallness against the light of God's glory and magnificence. And you say, like David, who am I and what is my house that you should so bless me? Instead of puffing our hearts out and employing our tongues to set ourselves up as some kind of little demigod in the world, the Christian ought to have that notion completely obliterated from his consciousness, because he is the man who by faith has seen God. Not only your smallness in the light of God's greatness, your sinfulness on top of that in the light of God's holiness. And these two truths together should be like one of these giant wrecking balls, you see, that's destroying the edifice of our pride. But yet when you take these truths to the natural man will hold out tooth and nail against it. I remember speaking to someone who had known me from my childhood, and I wasn't a Christian, and then I was a Christian. And I was sharing the gospel with them. And I explained the gospel so that they actually repeated the gospel back to me. There was no misconception in their minds with what I was saying. So you're saying that God is holy and that I'm sinful and that every part of my soul is corrupt? And I'm saying yes. And that the only answer that I have is to believe in Jesus or I'm going to hell. I said, absolutely. She said, if that is your God, I want nothing to do with him. Why? Pride. Pride. How dare you call me corrupt? How dare you call me a filthy sinner? How dare you tell me that God will not accept me for me? That's pride. But the overturning of that is the beginning of the Christian life. How then ought we not to be humble as Christians? The Christian has the true knowledge of God, and therefore he ought to have the true knowledge of himself. And then on top of that, faith recognizes its continual dependence upon God for everything. So that all that I have by the grace of God, and without him I am nothing and I have nothing. Now take that truth and apply it to all the little things we get proud over. It's so ridiculous. Some people get proud about their wealth. Where do they get their wealth from? Some people get proud over their possessions. Where did they get their possessions from? Some people get proud about their beauty. And they know they're good looking. They walk around, I'm so good looking, as if they made themselves good looking. And others, they walk about and they say, well, I'm so smart. Where'd you get your brain from? And Christians walk around thinking, well, I've got all of these talents. And yet we've no right to any of them. And all of them have been freely bestowed upon us. Some people get proud because they're taller than someone else. Look at you, Shorty. Well, tell me, how much effort did you put into becoming that tall? Remember how Paul deals with that? Who by taking thought can add one cubit unto his stature? How can the thing formed say unto him that formed him, why hast thou made me thus? What proud beggars we are. What blind lepers. Lowliness of mind. How do we cultivate it? Because we have the true knowledge of the true God, and with it we have the true knowledge of ourselves, and with it we have the recognition that everything that we have received by God's grace. And He's not finished. He's really going to destroy us next week when He takes the bigger wrecking ball of the mind of Christ, and He says, how could you ever be proud when the supreme example was so humble? That ought to kill our pride in a way that nothing else does. Kill pride, cultivate humility. Thirdly, consider others. Let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. My children, let me explain something to you. When Paul says here, let every man not look upon his own things, but every man also in the things of others, he's not saying, well, you know, my friend has a really nice toy and I would kind of like that, and so I'm looking at it covetously. He's not talking about that. We'll come to it in a moment. He's talking about their needs. He's speaking in the context of service. So he calls us from pride to humility, and the hinge upon which this door swings, pride to humility, has to do with our attitude and our actions towards others. This is where we're going to see if we've learned humility. And he tells us two things. First of all, you are to esteem your brothers better than yourself. You're to esteem others better than yourself. Now, you go out into the world, and the world's reference point for its own morality is its neighbour. And so they'll either idolize their neighbour and they'll try to pursue him. They'll make little gods of sports stars and film stars and pop groups and all the rest of them. If they're not doing that, they will destroy their fellow man. And sometimes we do both. We have this problem in Britain, maybe more than in America. We build someone up and they get up to such a height and then they fall and everybody takes out their sledgehammers and knocks them down. There's the two things in one. That's what the world does. Its moral reference point is its neighbour. And so we either idolize the neighbour and justify their way of life and try to pursue it, or we destroy our neighbour. We justify our sin and confirm our pride by pointing out that there are people that are worse than us. And then we flatter ourselves because we compare our gifts and our popularity over against those who are not as gifted or popular. That's easy. That's what comes natural to us. What is difficult is what Paul requires of us here. Let each esteem the other better than themselves. Now, Paul doesn't want you to be stupid here. You're not to walk around with this false sense of, well, you know, everybody's better than me. They're not. That's just patently obvious. They're not. Everybody is not smarter than you. Everybody is not more gifted than you. Everybody is not wiser than you. So parents, you shouldn't think that your children are wiser than you. They're not. He doesn't want you to be stupid and to ignore the obvious. However, he wants you to look at everybody else in the context of the true knowledge that you have of yourself, so that an awareness of your faults will mean that you do not magnify the faults in others. Remember how Jesus deals with this. He says, there's the man, and he's walking around with this huge log in his eye. And he's trying to get the little mote out of the other person's eye. Now, the problem was not that the person didn't have a mote in his eye and he would do well to get it out of his eye. The problem was the bigger fault was with the person who was trying to do the fixing. And Jesus doesn't say, just go and take the log out of your eye. He says, do that first and then go and help your brother. This is the same kind of thing that Paul is talking about here. Let each esteem the other better than themselves. An awareness of your own fault is going to temper your attitude and your outlook of other people. You're not going to magnify their faults. If anything, you're going to minimize their faults. But there's another side to that as well. When we look at other people's faults, we're not going to magnify them. But what about when we study someone else's virtues? Or do you even do that? You know, to be honest, to listen to us ourselves some of the time, we don't do this at all. Because our conversations always highlight the problem with the other person. Is that not the case? Well, hold on, let me back up. Be careful with universal terms. So we'll not say always. Often, our conversations often highlight the negatives on other people. He is this, she is that. This person in church, this person in college, this person in authority, and on and on and on and on we go. We are students of the faults of other people. And would to God we were studying our faults as much as we were studying the faults of other people. But Paul says, no. What you're to do is study the virtues of others and minimize their faults. The person who's writing here was able to write to the church in Ephesus and say, unto me, who am less than the least of all saints, is this grace given. Now remember, I said Paul doesn't want us to be stupid. Paul was not the less than the least of all saints in terms of gifts. He wasn't. He was immensely gifted. And he was teaching others who were drastically inferior to him in gifts. And yet he can say that, and it's by the inspiration of God's Spirit, it's true. That's how he felt. Do you ever stop to ask yourself, how does the Apostle Paul sincerely feel that within his heart? Unto me, who am less than the least of all saints, is this grace given? Well, the answer is because he had a proper estimate of his own faults, and he had a Christian study of other people's virtues, and he loved the virtues that he saw in other Christians, and he hated the faults that he saw in himself. And that tempered his whole outlook and his appreciation of other Christians. The story is told of George Whitefield. And Whitefield and Wesley had been formerly together, but they diverged theologically. Whitefield being Calvinistic in his outlook, Wesley being vehemently Arminian, saying all kinds of not very nice things about Whitefield and those who agreed with him. And somebody came trying to stir the pot one time with Whitefield, and He asked him, Mr. Whitfield, do you think you're going to see Mr. Wesley in heaven? Now, what he was really asking is, do you think Mr. Wesley's even a Christian? And Whitfield said no. And you can almost imagine that person rubbing their hands. I knew it, he's a heretic. Whitfield said no, I don't think I'll see him in heaven. He'll be far nearer the throne than me. That's an illustration of this point. Let each esteem the other better than themselves. Esteem your brothers better than yourselves. Then seek the good of other Christians. Verse 4. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Avoid selfishness. Become selfless in your Christian life. How many of our worlds revolve around self? This one-eyed monster, this cyclops of self. And we don't want to put that single eye called self, we don't want to put it out. It's firmly fixed upon us. Do you know where you'll see it? You'll see it when you are really uncomfortable and fed up, when you are ever asked or required to be put out for someone else. Someone asks you to do something, and it's just so inimical to you to even want to do it. But on the other hand, you expect it of other people. You expect people to be at your beck and call, to serve you, to do for you what you want them to do for you, but you will not do anything for other people. Do you know what that's called? Selfishness. And this one-eyed monster of self needs to be destroyed. And so people in churches, they think, well, other people are not serving me. There you are looking upon your own things. The very thing Paul says here, don't do it. Don't look upon your own things. People in this church are not serving me. Truth be told, in my pastoral experience, the people who complain in those terms are the people who are most guilty of not serving other people themselves. That's just an observation. It's 12 years in the ministry, it's not as long as 40, but it's an observation that I've picked up. All the focus is upon self, looking upon my own needs, not the needs of other people. And it's as if Paul says, I want you to forget about your problems just a minute. And to open your eyes and realize that you are surrounded by people in the church whose good you are to seek and who you are called to serve. Go and see what their needs are. Go and try to meet the needs that they have. Indeed, Paul widens it out in Galatians chapter 6, not only to Christians. He says there's a world lying out there that's needy, and you've got to go and see their needs as well, but especially the household of God. Especially the household of God. You are not to be like the leech in the book of Proverbs, who's always saying give, 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 give. But you are to be like a fountain of life that's not saying give me, it's always giving out. Look not upon your own things, but every man also upon the things of others. As you do this, you will fulfill the law of Jesus Christ. You will prove that you're walking according to the Spirit, Galatians chapter 5, verse 26. You will be imitating the example of Christ, verse 5 and following of Philippians chapter 2. All of those things are true and are motives. But listen, brethren, you will be helping yourself. You will be helping yourself. Because serving other people is one of the best things that you can do for yourself in the Christian life. Otherwise, we just become increasingly turned in on ourselves, self-focused. The story is told, and I'll close with this. You may have heard of Alexander Moody Stewart. He was a free church minister at the end of the 1800s, and you'll have heard of John Rabbi Duncan, who was a professor in the college. And Duncan was a very emotional man, and he was prone to very high highs and very low lows. And he struggled with assurance of faith very often. And he would lean upon Moody Stewart to help him. And, well, Moody Stewart would get a little bit tired of it sometimes, and he had his own work to do. And one Saturday he was in the study and he looked out the window and he saw John walking down the street, and he thought, oh no, I know that face. John's lost his assurance again. So he went down, met him at the door, and Duncan began his woe is me speech, and Moody Stewart said, John, I was speaking to that coach driver yesterday and he told me he was an atheist. And Duncan looked round. Which one? It's that one. Total atheist, denying that there's a God, despising the gospel of Christ. And Duncan says, well, I'm going to go and speak to him. And Moody Stewart records in his diary, the coach driver got the gospel, Duncan got his assurance, and I got my morning back. But you see, the point was this. Moody Stewart knew that if Duncan went and served that coachman with the gospel, it would help him. That's a principle for the whole of your Christian life. A call to humility. May the Lord bless his word to our hearts. Let's stand for prayer.